Hey everyone, hope you're doing well, and I'm so glad you've decided to join us again. Tonight we are exploring what it was like to fold letters in 17th century Venice. So before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like and subscribe. If you genuinely enjoy our nighttime stories, let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always so fascinating to see who's joining us from around the globe. Now it's time to dim the lights and relax as we start our story. In the narrow chambers above the workshops of Venice, during the year 1687, where the morning light filtered through small diamond-paned windows overlooking the canal waters, the daily ritual of letter preparation began with the careful selection of paper stock that had been delivered by the guild-regulated paper merchants from the mainland territories of the Venetian Republic. The paper itself, manufactured in the mills of Fabriano, according to specifications that had been debated and refined by the Venetian Scribes Guild throughout the preceding decades, arrived in sheets measuring precisely 24 by 18 inches, a standard that had emerged from lengthy discussions between the guild masters and the postal authorities during the reforms of 1643. The folding of correspondence in Venice during this period followed a complex system of regulations that had evolved through careful negotiation between various administrative bodies, including the Council of Ten's Postal Oversight Committee, the Guild of Letter Writers, and the maritime postal services that connected Venice to Constantinople, Alexandria, and London. Each letter required specific folding techniques, depending on its destination, the social rank of both sender and recipient, and the nature of the correspondence itself, whether commercial, diplomatic, or personal in character. For letters destined for the Ottoman territory, the folding process began with the placement of the written sheet face down upon a flat wooden surface that had been covered with a piece of fine felt cloth, imported from the wool markets of Flanders, and maintained according to guild specifications that required replacement every 18 months. The scribe would then measure exactly 3 inches from the left edge of the paper using a brass ruler that bore the stamp of the Venetian Weights and Measures Authority, creating a fold line that would accommodate the wax seal placement requirements established by the Treaty of Karlowitz postal agreements. The paper used for these Ottoman-bound letters was treated with a subtle sizing made from rabbit skin glue and powdered alum, a mixture that had been perfected by Venetian papermakers during the 1670s after extensive experimentation with various formulations. This treatment prevented the iron gall ink from spreading beyond acceptable parameters while ensuring that the paper would maintain its flexibility during the folding process, which often required multiple creases to achieve the compact dimensions necessary for efficient transport aboard the merchant galleys that departed Venice each Tuesday and Friday during the sailing season. When preparing correspondence for the German territories, the folding methodology differed substantially due to the postal requirements established by the Imperial Postmaster General in Vienna, whose regulations had been updated in 1681 to accommodate the increasing volume of commercial correspondence flowing between Venice and the Habsburg territories. These letters required a specific sequence of folds that began with a horizontal crease positioned exactly 4½ inches from the top edge of the paper, measured using the Venetian standard inch that had been calibrated against the bronze measuring rod maintained in the Doge's palace since 1594. The tools employed in the folding process were themselves subject to guild regulations that specified the materials, dimensions and maintenance requirements for each implement. The bone folder, carved from cattle bone that had been aged for a minimum of 2 years in the salt air of the Venetian lagoon, measured precisely 6 inches in length, and featured a perfectly smooth edge that had been polished using increasingly fine grades of pumice stone imported from the volcanic regions near Naples. The bone folder required daily cleaning with a solution of vinegar and salt water, followed by careful drying with linen cloths that had been woven according to specifications maintained by the Textile Guild. For letters bound for England, which travelled via the overland route through the Alpine passes during winter months, and by sea during the favourable sailing seasons, the folding process incorporated additional security measures that had been developed following incidents of correspondence tampering, reported by Venetian merchants in London during the 1670s. These letters employed a double folding technique that began with the standard horizontal fold, followed by a diagonal fold that created a triangular flap, measuring exactly 2 inches at its base, providing additional protection for the wax seal while ensuring compliance with English postal regulations. The sealing wax itself played a crucial role in the folding process, as different destinations required different colors and compositions of wax according to international postal conventions. Letters to Ottoman territories used deep red wax made from cinnabar and beeswax, mixed in proportions that had been established by the Venetian diplomatic corps during negotiations in 1673. The wax was heated using small brass braziers that burned charcoal produced specifically for this purpose from oak trees harvested in the forests of the Veneto region, creating a consistent flame temperature that prevented the wax from becoming either too fluid or too viscous for proper application. For correspondence directed to the papal territories, including Rome and the surrounding regions under Vatican administration, the folding requirements incorporated additional ceremonial elements that reflected the complex relationship between the Venetian Republic and the Holy See. These letters required 3 distinct folds, each executed with particular precision to create a final form that measured exactly 4 inches by 6 inches when complete. The first fold was made along a line positioned 3 inches from the right edge of the paper, using a technique that created a sharp crease without damaging the paper fibers, a skill that required considerable practice to master properly. The workspace where these folding operations took place was arranged according to principles that had been codified by the Guild of Letter Writers during their organizational reforms of 1658. The primary work surface consisted of a table constructed from Istrian stone, polished to a perfectly flat finish that provided the stable foundation necessary for precise measurement and folding operations. This table was positioned beneath a window that faced north, ensuring consistent lighting throughout the day while minimizing the fading effects of direct sunlight on the papers and inks used in the correspondence preparation process. Adjacent to the primary work surface, a secondary table held the various implements required for the folding process, arranged in a specific order that had been determined through decades of practical experience by the guild masters. The brass rulers were arranged according to length, from the smallest 6-inch ruler used for measuring seal placement to the largest 18-inch ruler employed for full sheet measurements. Each ruler was cleaned daily with a solution of lemon juice and salt, then dried with silk cloths that had been imported from the workshops of Lucca specifically for this purpose. The storage of papers awaiting folding followed equally specific protocols, with different grades and sizes of paper stored in separate compartments of a large oak cabinet that had been constructed according to designs approved by the Guild Council in 1672. Each compartment was lined with linen cloth that had been treated with lavender oil to prevent pest infestation while maintaining the proper humidity levels necessary to preserve the paper quality. The papers were arranged with identifying markers made from small pieces of parchment that indicated the paper grade origin and intended use for each batch. During the winter months, when the dampness from the canals could affect paper quality, additional precautions were implemented to ensure that the folding process maintained consistent standards. Braziers filled with burning sandalwood were placed strategically around the workspace to maintain appropriate temperature and humidity levels, while screens made from oiled silk were positioned to deflect drafts that might disturb the papers during the folding operations. These environmental controls had been developed through extensive experimentation during the particularly harsh winter of 1683, when several important commercial correspondence shipments were delayed due to papers that had become too brittle for proper folding. The training process for new letter folders involved a comprehensive apprenticeship program that lasted 3 years and covered all aspects of the folding craft, from the selection and preparation of materials to the execution of the most complex folding sequences required for diplomatic correspondence. Apprentices began their training by learning to fold simple domestic letters, gradually progressing to more complex commercial correspondence, and finally advancing to the diplomatic and ecclesiastical letters that required the highest levels of skill and precision. The Guild maintained detailed records of each apprentice's progress through a system of evaluation marks that were recorded in leather-bound ledgers using iron gall ink mixed according to a formula that had been refined over several decades of use. These records included not only assessments of technical competence but also evaluations of the apprentice's understanding of the postal regulations, diplomatic protocols and commercial requirements that govern different types of correspondence folding. For letters containing particularly sensitive commercial information, such as those relating to spice trading contracts or banking arrangements, additional security folding techniques were employed that incorporated multiple layers of protection against unauthorized opening. These techniques involved the use of specially prepared papers that had been treated with chemicals that would reveal evidence of tampering, combined with folding patterns that made it virtually impossible to open and reseal the letter without leaving visible traces of interference. The seasonal variations in folding requirements reflected the changing patterns of maritime commerce that connected Venice to markets throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. During spring and summer, when shipping schedules were most reliable, letters could be folded using standard techniques that prioritized efficiency and volume processing. However, during autumn and winter months, when weather delays were common and shipping schedules became irregular, folding techniques emphasized durability and protection against moisture, requiring additional layers of oiled paper and more complex sealing procedures. The relationship between the letter folding craft and the broader administrative structures of the Venetian Republic was formalized through a series of regulations that had been developed during the governmental reforms of the 1670s. These regulations established specific requirements for the folding of official government correspondence, including letters from the Doge's office, communications between various councils and committees, and diplomatic correspondence with foreign powers. Each category of official correspondence required distinct folding techniques that incorporated security features appropriate to the sensitivity of the information being transmitted. The tools used for measuring and marking fold lines were crafted by specialized artisans who worked exclusively for the letter folding trade, creating implements that met the precise specifications required for this delicate work. These craftsmen, who formed their own small guild within the larger structure of Venetian trades organizations, maintained workshops near the Rialto Bridge, where they could easily supply the letter folding establishments throughout the city with replacement tools and equipment as needed. Quality control procedures for folded letters involved systematic inspection by guild-appointed supervisors who examined each piece of correspondence for compliance with established standards before it was released for postal dispatch. These inspections checked not only the technical aspects of the folding work but also verified that appropriate materials had been used and that all regulatory requirements had been met according to the destination and type of correspondence involved. The relationship between paper grain direction and folding quality had been extensively studied by guild masters during the 1670s, leading to detailed specifications for paper orientation during the folding process. Papers with grain running parallel to the long dimension required different folding techniques than those with grain running parallel to the short dimension, and these differences were carefully documented in guild training manuals that were updated annually to reflect new discoveries and refinements in technique. Storage of completed folded letters awaiting dispatch required separate facilities that maintained optimal conditions for preserving the integrity of the folding work until the letters could be loaded aboard ships or transferred to overland couriers. These storage areas were maintained at specific temperature and humidity levels, through the use of ventilation systems that had been designed by engineers working under commission from the postal authorities, ensuring that the careful folding work would not be compromised during the waiting period before dispatch. The economic aspects of the letter folding trade were regulated through a complex system of fees and charges that reflected both the skill required for different types of folding work and the materials consumed in the process. Simple domestic letters required basic folding fees, while complex diplomatic correspondence commanded premium charges that reflected the additional time, skill and security measures involved in their preparation. These fee structures were reviewed annually by joint committees representing the various guilds and administrative bodies involved in postal operations. During periods of high postal volume, such as the weeks preceding major religious festivals or commercial fair seasons, additional temporary workers were employed to supplement the regular guild members in completing folding operations. These temporary workers, typically drawn from related trades such as bookbinding or paper manufacturing, were required to demonstrate basic competency in folding techniques before being permitted to work on correspondence, ensuring that quality standards were maintained even during peak demand periods. The environmental impact of the letter folding industry on Venice itself was carefully monitored by city authorities, particularly regarding the disposal of paper scraps and waste materials generated during the folding process.
Regulations required that all paper waste be collected and sold to specific recycling operations that converted the material into lower-grade papers suitable for wrapping and packaging purposes, ensuring that nothing was wasted from the precious imported paper supplies. Regional variations in folding techniques reflected the diverse destinations served by Venetian postal networks, with specific methods developed for correspondence bound for the Dutch territories, the Spanish kingdoms, the various German principalities, and the English territories. Each regional variant incorporated elements designed to meet local postal requirements while maintaining compatibility with Venetian administrative standards and security protocols. The apprentice evaluation process included practical examinations conducted under the supervision of multiple guild masters, ensuring objective assessment of technical competency across all aspects of the folding craft. These examinations tested not only manual dexterity and precision, but also knowledge of postal regulations, understanding of different paper types and their handling requirements, and familiarity with the various tools and materials used in professional letter folding operations. Winter working conditions required additional lighting arrangements using carefully positioned oil lamps that provided adequate illumination for precise folding work without creating fire hazards in the paper-filled workshops. These lighting systems were designed and installed by specialists who understood both the illumination requirements of detailed handwork and the fire safety concerns associated with open flames in environments containing large quantities of combustible materials. The Guild Library maintained extensive collections of reference materials documenting folding techniques, postal regulations and diplomatic protocols that were consulted regularly by practicing letter folders seeking guidance on unusual or complex correspondence requirements. These reference works were hand-copied by scribes working under Guild supervision, ensuring accuracy and consistency in the information available to Guild members throughout their careers. Quality maintenance of folding tools required regular attention from the craftsmen who had originally created them, with systematic schedules for sharpening, polishing and reconditioning that ensured optimal performance throughout their useful life. The Guild maintained contracts with these craftsmen that guaranteed priority service for tool maintenance, recognizing the critical importance of properly functioning implements to the quality of folding work. The integration of folding operations with the broader postal system required careful coordination with ship schedules, overland courier routes, and diplomatic pouches that carried Venetian correspondence to destinations throughout Europe and the Mediterranean region. This coordination involved daily consultation with postal administrators who provided information about sailing schedules, route conditions, and any special requirements for particular shipments of correspondence. During the gradual transition from winter to spring working conditions, folding techniques were adjusted to accommodate changing environmental factors that affected both paper handling and sealing wax consistency. These seasonal adjustments had been documented through years of careful observation and experimentation, creating a body of practical knowledge that guided the adaptation of folding operations to maintain consistent quality throughout the changing seasons. The record-keeping requirements for folding operations involved detailed documentation of materials used, time spent on different categories of correspondence, and quality control assessments that were compiled into monthly reports submitted to Guild authorities and postal administrators. These records provided the statistical foundation for evaluating the efficiency and effectiveness of folding operations while identifying areas where improvements in technique or organization might enhance overall performance. As evening approached in the workshops above the Venetian canals, the day's folding work would gradually slow to completion, with the final letters carefully placed in their designated storage areas to await the next day's postal dispatch, while the tools were cleaned and arranged for the following morning's work, continuing the quiet, methodical rhythm that had sustained this essential craft through decades of Venetian commercial correspondence, maintaining the delicate connections that bound the merchant republic to markets and allies across the known world.
How they weighed spices in a medieval market. The careful craft of measurement and commerce in the bustling trading centres of 13th century Europe. In the covered market halls of Bruges during the autumn of 1287, where the morning mist from the canals mixed with the aromatic clouds rising from sacks of cinnamon and pepper, The daily ritual of spice weighing began before dawn, with the careful inspection of bronze scales that had been crafted according to specifications maintained by the Guild of Weighers since their charter was granted by the Count of Flanders in 1253. These scales, suspended from iron hooks embedded in the massive oak beams that supported the market hall roof, required daily calibration using standardized weights that were kept locked in the guild's strongbox and inspected monthly by appointed officials who traveled between the major trading centers to ensure consistency across the region. The process of weighing precious spices demanded equipment of exceptional precision, beginning with the scales themselves, which were constructed from bronze that had been cast in specialized foundries located near Dinant, where craftsmen had perfected techniques for creating measuring instruments that would maintain their accuracy despite the constant use and exposure to the humid conditions of the covered markets. Each scale consisted of two circular pans suspended by chains from a central beam that pivoted on a knife-edge bearing made from hardened steel, a design that had evolved through decades of refinement as merchants and guild officials worked together to develop increasingly reliable methods for measuring the valuable commodities that flowed through these commercial centers. The weights used for measuring spices were themselves marvels of medieval precision engineering, cast from brass and lead alloys in carefully controlled proportions that had been established through extensive testing during the guild reforms of 1271. The smallest weights, used for measuring the most precious spices such as saffron and long pepper, were no larger than a fingernail, yet were crafted with such precision that experienced weighers could detect differences as small as half a grain of wheat. These tiny weights were stored in individual compartments of wooden boxes lined with velvet cloth that prevented them from becoming scratched or damaged during handling, as even the smallest imperfection could affect their accuracy when dealing with spices that might cost more than a craftsman's annual wages. Before any weighing could commence, the scales required a thorough cleaning process that removed the accumulated residue from previous days' trading activities. This cleaning involved brushing each pan with brushes made from boar bristles that had been trimmed to specific lengths to ensure thorough cleaning without causing damage to the bronze surfaces. The chains were inspected link by link for signs of wear or stretching that might affect the balance accuracy, and any questionable links were replaced with new ones that had been tested and approved by the guild inspectors, who maintained detailed records of all scale maintenance activities. The spices themselves arrived at the market in various containers that reflected their origins and the long journeys they had undertaken to reach these northern European trading centers. Pepper, the most commonly traded spice, arrived in large hemp sacks that had been waterproofed with pine tar and sealed with lead stamps bearing the marks of merchants from Venice, Genoa, and other Mediterranean ports. These sacks typically contained between 100 and 200 pounds of peppercorns, but the contents required careful sampling and weighing to determine the exact quantity, as moisture loss during transport, contamination with debris, and the natural variation in peppercorn size all affected the final weight calculations. Cinnamon bark arrived in wooden casks that had been constructed specifically for spice transport, with tight-fitting lids secured by iron bands that prevented moisture infiltration during the sea voyage from Alexandria or Constantinople. The bark pieces varied considerably in size and quality, requiring individual examination and weighing to establish accurate pricing based on the complex grading systems that had been developed by spice merchants over generations of trading experience. The finest cinnamon bark, thin and aromatic with a sweet flavor, commanded premium prices that might be 10 times higher than the coarser, thicker bark pieces that were still valuable but suited to different culinary applications. The weighing process for each type of spice followed specific protocols that had been documented in the guild regulations, which were written on parchment scrolls that were consulted regularly during training of new apprentice weighers. For pepper, the standard procedure required taking samples from different portions of each sack to ensure that the weight calculations reflected the true average quality of the entire shipment. These samples were weighed using the medium-sized weights that ranged from 1 ounce to 1 pound, with the results recorded on tally sticks that were notched according to a coding system that indicated both quantity and quality grades. Saffron, the most precious of all spices, required the most delicate weighing procedures due to its extraordinary value, and the ease with which it could be adulterated with less expensive materials. The dried stigmas arrived in small leather pouches that rarely contained more than a few ounces, yet each pouch represented considerable wealth and required handling with extreme care. The weighing of saffron employed the smallest and most precise scales, with individual measurements recorded to the nearest quarter grain using weights so small that they had to be handled with tweezers made from polished steel, to prevent the oils from human fingers from affecting their accuracy. The seasonal variations in spice trading created different challenges for the weighing operations throughout the year. During the spring months, when the first ships arrived from the Mediterranean after winter storms had prevented regular sailing schedules, the accumulated demand for spices created intense activity in the market halls. Weighers worked longer hours to process the backlog of orders from merchants who had been waiting months for fresh supplies, and the increased volume required additional temporary scales and weights to be brought out from guild storage areas where they were kept during slower trading periods. Summer brought its own challenges as the increased heat and humidity affected both the spices themselves and the weighing equipment. Spices that had been perfectly dry when they arrived might absorb moisture from the air, increasing their weight and potentially affecting their quality. The bronze scales expanded slightly in the heat, requiring more frequent calibration checks using the standard weights that were kept in the coolest part of the guild strongbox. Weighers learned to make small adjustments to their techniques to compensate for these environmental factors, drawing on generations of accumulated experience in dealing with the practical challenges of precision measurement in varying conditions. The guild training program for spice weighers involved a comprehensive 3-year apprenticeship that began with learning to identify different grades and qualities of each major spice through careful examination of color, aroma, texture and taste. Apprentices spent months learning to detect the subtle differences that distinguished premium saffron from inferior grades, or to identify the various types of pepper that commanded different prices in the marketplace. This training included extensive practice with the scales and weights under the supervision of experienced guild members, who could identify and correct the small errors in technique that might lead to significant discrepancies in measurement. The record-keeping requirements for spice weighing operations involved maintaining detailed logs that documented every transaction, including the identity of the merchant, the type and grade of spice, the exact weight measured, and any special circumstances that might have affected the weighing process. These records were written using iron gall ink on parchment that had been prepared according to guild specifications, ensuring that the documentation would remain legible for the years or decades that might pass before disputes over particular transactions were resolved through the guild court system. Quality control procedures required regular verification that scales were maintaining their accuracy through comparison weighings using known standard quantities of various materials. These verification procedures were conducted using samples of grain, small metal objects, and even water in standardized containers, with the results compared to established baselines that indicated whether each scale was performing within acceptable tolerances. Any scale that failed these tests was immediately removed from service until it could be repaired or recalibrated by guild craftsmen, who specialized in maintaining measuring equipment. The relationship between the weighing operations and the broader economic structures of medieval commerce was formalized through contracts and agreements that established the rights and responsibilities of weighers, merchants and guild authorities. These agreements specified the fees charged for weighing services, the procedures for resolving disputes over measurements, and the standards that governed the accuracy and reliability of weighing operations. The contracts were renewed annually, and required approval from both guild authorities and the municipal officials who regulated commercial activities within the market areas. Different spices required specialized handling techniques that reflected their unique characteristics and the particular challenges they presented for accurate weighing. Nutmeg, which arrived as individual nuts of varying sizes, required careful sorting and individual weighing to establish pricing based on size and quality grades. Cloves, with their distinctive shape and strong aroma, needed to be handled gently to prevent breaking that might affect their market value. Ginger root arrived in irregular pieces that required skilled assessment to determine the appropriate pricing based on factors including size, age and moisture content. The storage of spices awaiting weighing operations required specialized facilities that maintained optimal conditions for preserving quality, while preventing contamination or mixing between different varieties and grades.
These storage areas were constructed with stone walls and floors that could be easily cleaned, with wooden shelving that had been treated with oils that repelled insects without affecting the spice's flavors. Each storage compartment was clearly marked with symbols that indicated the type of spice, its origin, and the date of arrival, information that was essential for proper rotation of inventory and maintenance of quality standards. Winter weighing operations required additional precautions to ensure accuracy, despite the cold conditions that could affect both the equipment and the spices themselves. Oil lamps provided both light and warmth in the measuring areas, positioned carefully to illuminate the scales without creating fire hazards near the combustible spice materials. The bronze scales contracted in cold weather, requiring adjustments to the calibration procedures that took into account the dimensional changes that occurred when temperatures dropped significantly below the conditions under which the original calibrations had been established. The apprentice evaluation system included practical examinations that tested not only technical competency in weighing procedures, but also knowledge of spice identification, quality assessment, and the commercial regulations that govern spice trading activities. These examinations were conducted by panels of experienced guild members, who evaluated each candidate's ability to perform accurate measurements under various conditions, including situations designed to test their ability to detect and prevent common forms of fraud or adulteration that might affect spice quality and value. Regional variations in spice preferences and quality standards required weighers to maintain familiarity with the different specifications that applied to spices destined for various markets throughout Northern Europe. Spices bound for England might require different packaging and documentation than those destined for German territories, while spices intended for local consumption could be subject to different quality standards than those being prepared for re-export to other trading centers. These variations were documented in reference materials that weighers consulted regularly to ensure compliance with all applicable regulations. The maintenance schedules for weighing equipment involved systematic inspection and care procedures that ensured reliable performance throughout the equipment's useful life. Bronze scales were polished monthly, using techniques that removed corrosion and wear marks without affecting their precision, while the steel knife edges that formed the fulcrums for the balance mechanisms required even more careful attention to maintain their sharpness and accuracy. The chains that suspended the weighing pans were inspected regularly for signs of stretching or wear that might affect balance sensitivity. Economic fluctuations in spice prices created additional challenges for weighing operations as merchants became increasingly concerned about accuracy when price variations could significantly affect the value of even small discrepancies in measurement. During periods of high prices, merchants might request multiple independent weighings to verify quantities, while periods of low prices might see increased attempts at fraud through the use of weights that had been altered to show false measurements. Guild officials developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for detecting altered weights and fraudulent practices that might compromise the integrity of the weighing system. The coordination between weighing operations and the transportation systems that moved spices from the markets to their final destinations required careful attention to packaging and documentation that would preserve the accuracy of weight measurements throughout the distribution process. Spices were typically repackaged into smaller containers after weighing, with each container marked to indicate its exact contents and weight. These markings used standardized symbols and codes that could be understood by merchants and officials throughout the trading network, ensuring that the careful measurements conducted in the market halls would be preserved through all subsequent handling. Environmental controls in the weighing areas included ventilation systems that maintained air circulation without creating drafts that might affect the sensitive balance operations. These ventilation systems were designed by craftsmen who understood both the need for fresh air circulation and the requirement for stable conditions during weighing procedures. Windows were positioned to provide natural lighting while minimizing temperature fluctuations that might affect equipment accuracy, and shutters could be adjusted throughout the day to maintain optimal conditions for precision weighing work. The documentation of unusual circumstances that might affect weighing operations included detailed descriptions of weather conditions, equipment problems, or irregularities in spice quality that were noted in the official records maintained by each weighing station. These notes provided valuable information for resolving disputes that might arise weeks or months after particular transactions were completed, and they also contributed to the accumulated knowledge base that helped guild officials develop improved procedures for handling similar situations in the future. Training in the detection of adulterated or contaminated spices required extensive experience with authentic samples that provided the reference standards for identifying deviations from normal quality characteristics. Apprentice weighers learned to recognize the visual, aromatic and tactile clues that indicated when spices had been mixed with less valuable materials or had been damaged during transport or storage. This training involved systematic comparison of known authentic samples with specimens that had been deliberately adulterated to help develop the observational skills necessary for detecting fraud in commercial settings. The ritual aspects of spice weighing operations included traditional practices that had been passed down through generations of guild members, such as the blessing of new scales before their first use and the ceremonial procedures that marked the beginning of each trading season. These traditions provided continuity and helped maintain the professional identity of the weighing craft while reinforcing the importance of accuracy and integrity in commercial measurement operations that formed the foundation of trust between merchants from different regions and cultures. As the afternoon light began to fade through the high windows of the market hall, the pace of weighing operations would gradually slow as merchants completed their daily transactions and prepared their purchases for transport to distant markets, while the weighers carefully cleaned and secured their equipment in preparation for the next day's activities, maintaining the precise tools and careful procedures that sustained the complex networks of commerce that connected the spice-producing regions of the distant East with the kitchens and tables of medieval Europe, one carefully measured portion at a time.
A day in the life of a Roman candlemaker, the methodical craft of creating illumination in ancient Rome through traditional techniques and daily routines. The workshop of Marcus Aurelius Luminarius stood quietly in the Suburra district of Rome, its heavy wooden shutters still closed against the pale light that filtered through the narrow streets in the early hours before dawn. The air inside held the familiar mixture of beeswax, tallow, and the faint smokiness that seemed to settle into every surface after years of candle production. On this particular morning in the spring of 127 AD, during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, the daily routine would unfold with the same measured precision that had characterized this trade for generations. The preparation of materials began before the sun had fully cleared the 7 hills of Rome. Marcus moved through his workspace with the deliberate care of someone whose hands knew every texture and weight by touch alone. The large ceramic vessels that held the day's supply of tallow sat arranged along the eastern wall, their contents having been rendered the previous evening from the fat of cattle brought from the markets beyond the Forum Burarium. The process of rendering had required constant attention, with the fat heated slowly over carefully maintained coals until it reached that precise temperature where it would separate cleanly from any remaining tissue without developing the acrid smell that would make the finished candles unpleasant to burn. The beeswax, stored in smaller but heavier containers, represented the more costly portion of his materials. This wax had been purchased from a dealer who maintained connections with beekeepers working the countryside around Latium, and its quality could be determined by its color and scent. The finest wax held a pale golden hue, and carried the subtle fragrance of honey and flowers, while lesser grades showed darker tones and sometimes bore traces of propolis that would need to be filtered out during the melting process. Marcus had learned to evaluate wax by rolling small portions between his fingers, feeling for the proper consistency that would indicate it had been properly cleaned and refined. The wicks presented their own set of considerations and preparation requirements. These were not simply strips of cloth, but carefully constructed elements that required specific materials and techniques. The finest wicks were made from the pith of papyrus plants, obtained through a network of suppliers who specialized in providing materials to various craftsmen throughout the city. The papyrus pith needed to be cut into uniform strips, each approximately the width of a man's smallest finger, and then treated with a light coating of wax to ensure proper burning characteristics. Alternative wick materials included twisted strands of flax fiber, which burned with a slightly different flame pattern, and occasionally cotton fibers imported from regions beyond the Mediterranean, though these were reserved for special orders due to their higher cost. The preparation of wicks involved a process that Marcus had refined over the course of 15 years in the trade. Each strip of papyrus pith was examined for uniformity and any imperfections that might cause uneven burning. The strips were then arranged on a flat wooden board and lightly coated with melted beeswax, using a brush made from bundled plant fibers. The wax application required careful attention to ensure even coverage without excess that might cause dripping during the burning process. After the initial wax treatment, the wicks were hung from wooden frames to dry and cure, a process that took several hours during warm weather and might extend overnight during the cooler months. The actual candle forming process began with the preparation of the molds, which were carved from dense hardwood and maintained with regular applications of olive oil to prevent the wax from adhering to their surfaces. Marcus kept 12 molds of various sizes, ranging from small votive candles suitable for household shrines to larger ceremonial pieces used in temple rituals. Each mold consisted of 2 halves that could be fitted together with bronze clasps, creating a smooth interior cavity shape to produce candles of consistent dimensions and proportions. Before pouring any wax, each mold required careful cleaning and preparation. The interior surfaces were wiped clean with soft cloths, then lightly oiled using a mixture of olive oil and beeswax that had been heated just enough to achieve a liquid consistency. The prepared wicks were positioned within the molds using thin bronze wires that could be adjusted to ensure the wick remained perfectly centered throughout the length of the finished candle. This centering was crucial, as an off-center wick would cause uneven burning and might lead to customer complaints or reduced repeat business. The melting of wax required constant supervision and precise temperature control. Marcus used a system of nested bronze vessels, with the inner pot containing the wax and the outer vessel holding water that was heated over a carefully maintained charcoal fire. This arrangement prevented the wax from reaching temperatures that might cause it to darken or develop unpleasant odors. The water in the outer vessel needed to be maintained at a gentle simmer, never allowed to boil vigorously, as this would create temperature fluctuations that could affect the quality of the finished product. Different types of candles required different wax preparations. For the most expensive ceremonial candles, pure beeswax was used without any additions. For household candles of moderate price, beeswax was mixed with high-quality tallow in proportions that varied according to the intended use and price point. The least expensive candles were made primarily from tallow, with just enough beeswax added to improve their burning characteristics and reduce the amount of smoke they produced. The mixing of wax and tallow required careful attention to achieving uniform consistency. The materials needed to be heated to similar temperatures before combining, and the mixture stirred continuously with wooden paddles to prevent separation or uneven distribution. Marcus had developed a technique for testing the mixture by allowing small amounts to cool on a bronze plate, examining the resulting texture and color to ensure the proportions were correct for each type of candle being produced. Pouring the wax into molds was a process that demanded steady hands and consistent timing. The temperature of the wax mixture needed to be hot enough to flow smoothly and fill all areas of the mold completely, but not so hot that it might damage the wick or create air bubbles that would mar the finished surface. Marcus poured slowly and steadily, allowing the wax to settle gradually and preventing the formation of seams or irregularities that would be visible in the completed candle. After pouring, the molds were left undisturbed while the wax cooled and solidified. The cooling time varied depending on the size of the candles and the ambient temperature in the workshop, but Marcus had learned to judge the proper timing by observing subtle changes in the appearance of the wax surface. Removing candles from their molds too early could result in deformation or surface imperfections, while leaving them too long might make removal more difficult and potentially damage the mold surfaces. The finishing process for each candle involved several detailed steps. Once removed from the molds, each piece was examined for flaws such as air bubbles, uneven surfaces, or wick irregularities. Minor surface imperfections could be corrected by careful scraping with bronze tools, while more significant problems required the candle to be remelted and reformed. The base of each candle was trimmed to ensure it would stand properly, and the wick was cut to the appropriate length for optimal burning. Quality control represented an essential aspect of maintaining the reputation that allowed Marcus to compete successfully with other candle makers throughout the city. Each finished candle underwent testing that involved lighting it briefly to observe the flame characteristics, smoke production, and burning rate. Candles that burned too quickly, produced excessive smoke, or showed uneven flame patterns were set aside for reprocessing rather than being offered for sale. The workshop maintained detailed records of production that served both practical and business purposes. Marcus kept track of the quantities of raw materials used, the number of candles produced in each category, and notes about seasonal variations in material quality or customer preferences. These records were maintained on wax tablets that could be reused, with important information periodically transferred to papyrus scrolls for permanent storage. Customer orders required individual attention and often involved specific requirements for size, burning duration, or decorative elements. Temple orders might specify particular dimensions based on the architectural features of altar spaces, while wealthy households sometimes requested candles with specific burning times to coordinate with religious observances or social events. Marcus maintained a system for tracking these special orders, ensuring that each customer's requirements were met precisely and delivered according to the agreed schedule. The business relationships that sustained the workshop extended throughout various sectors of Roman commerce. Suppliers of raw materials needed to be evaluated continuously for quality and reliability, as variations in beeswax purity or tallow consistency could affect entire batches of candles. Marcus had developed relationships with several suppliers for each type of material, allowing him to maintain consistent production even when individual sources experienced shortages or quality problems. Competition among candle makers in Rome was managed through informal agreements about pricing and territory, though these arrangements required constant attention and occasional renegotiation. Marcus had established a regular customer base that included several temples, a number of wealthy households, and various shops that resold candles to individual customers. Maintaining these relationships required not only consistent product quality but also reliable delivery schedules and competitive pricing that reflected current material costs. The seasonal aspects of the candle-making trade influenced both production schedules and business planning. During the longer days of summer, demand for candles decreased somewhat, but this period was ideal for building inventory and experimenting with new techniques or materials. Winter months brought increased demand but also challenges related to maintaining proper working temperatures in the workshop and ensuring adequate supplies of materials when transportation became more difficult. Storage of finished candles required careful attention to environmental conditions. Excessive heat could cause deformation, while cold temperatures might make the wax brittle and prone to cracking. Marcus maintained storage areas at different locations within the workshop, each suited to particular types of candles and designed to protect the inventory from temperature fluctuations, moisture, and dust accumulation. The daily routine in the workshop followed patterns that had been developed over years of experience with the various processes involved in candle production. Early morning hours were devoted to material preparation and planning the day's production schedule. The middle portions of the day, when ambient temperatures were most suitable, were used for the actual forming and pouring processes. Late afternoon and evening hours were reserved for finishing work, quality inspection, and preparation for the following day's activities. Tool maintenance represented another ongoing responsibility that required regular attention. The bronze vessels used for melting wax needed periodic cleaning to remove residue that might affect the quality of subsequent batches. Wooden molds required oiling and occasional repair or replacement of worn surfaces. The various implements used for stirring, pouring, and finishing needed to be kept clean and properly stored to prevent damage or contamination. The relationship between candle makers and the broader economic system of Rome involved considerations that extended beyond the immediate processes of production and sale. The guild system that governed various trades included provisions for candle makers, establishing standards for materials and methods while also providing mechanisms for resolving disputes between practitioners of the craft. Marcus participated in guild meetings where matters of common concern were discussed and decisions made about training new apprentices or responding to changes in material costs or customer demands. Apprenticeship in the candle-making trade involved a structured progression through various levels of responsibility and skill development. New apprentices typically began with simple tasks such as preparing wicks or cleaning equipment,
gradually advancing to more complex processes as their understanding and capabilities developed. Marcus had trained several apprentices over the years, and the success of former students in establishing their own workshops served as a source of both pride and practical benefit, as these relationships often led to referrals of customers or collaboration on large orders. The technical aspects of flame characteristics represented an area of specialized knowledge that distinguished experienced candle makers from casual practitioners. The ideal candle flame burned steadily without flickering, produced minimal smoke, and consumed the wax at a rate that provided useful illumination for extended periods. Achieving these characteristics required understanding the relationships between wick materials, wax composition, candle dimensions, and environmental factors such as air currents and ambient temperature. Innovation in candle-making techniques occurred gradually, often through small modifications to traditional methods rather than dramatic changes in fundamental approaches. Marcus had experimented with different wick treatments, alternative mold designs, and various approaches to wax preparation, always evaluating new techniques against established standards for quality and efficiency. Some innovations proved useful and were incorporated into regular production methods, while others were abandoned after testing revealed disadvantages or complications. The economic calculations that governed the workshop operations required ongoing attention to the balance between material costs, labor time, and selling prices. Marcus tracked the costs associated with different types of raw materials, monitoring market fluctuations that might affect profitability or require adjustments to production plans. The time required for various processes was also evaluated regularly, as improvements in efficiency could allow for increased production or reduced costs without compromising quality. Regional variations in candle-making techniques and materials provided opportunities for both learning and differentiation. Practitioners from different parts of the empire occasionally shared information about local methods or materials, and Marcus had incorporated several techniques learned from colleagues who had trained in other cities or provinces. These adaptations needed to be evaluated carefully to ensure they were compatible with local materials and customer expectations. The physical demands of candle making required attention to workplace organization and personal health considerations. The heat generated by the melting processes, combined with the concentrated attention required for precise work, could be fatiguing during long production sessions. Marcus had developed routines for managing these challenges, including scheduled breaks, adequate ventilation, and workspace arrangements that minimized unnecessary movement or strain. Documentation of successful techniques and material combinations served both practical and training purposes. Marcus maintained detailed notes about the specific procedures that produced the best results for different types of candles, including precise measurements, timing considerations, and observations about material characteristics. This information proved valuable when training apprentices, or when returning to production of specialized items after extended periods focused on other types of work. The integration of candle making with other related crafts created opportunities for collaboration and specialization. Some customers required candles with decorative elements that were beyond Marcus's expertise, leading to partnerships with artisans who specialized in carving or metalwork. These relationships required coordination of schedules and quality standards, but they also opened access to customer segments that might not otherwise have been reached. Weather conditions affected various aspects of the candle-making process, from the behavior of materials during heating and cooling, to the comfort and efficiency of working conditions. Marcus had learned to adjust his daily schedules and techniques based on seasonal patterns and short-term weather variations, ensuring consistent production quality regardless of external environmental factors. The gradual accumulation of experience in the craft continued to reveal subtle aspects of technique and material behavior that were not apparent to newer practitioners. Marcus found that his understanding of how different waxes responded to heating, how various wick materials affected burning characteristics, and how environmental factors influenced the production process continued to deepen even after years of daily practice. Customer education sometimes became necessary when dealing with buyers who were unfamiliar with the proper use or care of different types of candles. Marcus provided guidance about optimal burning conditions, proper trimming of wicks, and storage methods that would preserve candle quality over extended periods. This educational aspect of customer service often led to increased satisfaction and repeat business. The workshop's location in the Subura district provided advantages in terms of access to suppliers and customers, but it also required attention to security and fire prevention measures. The concentrated nature of the neighborhood, with various craftsmen and merchants operating in close proximity, created both opportunities for collaboration and challenges related to competition and resource allocation. As the afternoon progressed and the day's production activities moved toward their conclusion, Marcus turned his attention to the methodical tasks of cleaning equipment, organizing materials for the following day, and conducting final quality inspections of completed work. The bronze vessels were cleaned with warm water and soft cloths, dried thoroughly, and arranged in their designated storage locations. Wooden tools were wiped clean and checked for signs of wear or damage that might require repair or replacement. The process of banking the charcoal fires required careful attention to ensure safety while preserving coals that could be easily rekindled the next morning. Excess heat was allowed to dissipate gradually, with the coals arranged to maintain a low level of combustion that would provide a reliable starting point for the following day's work. The workspace was swept clean of wax drippings and other debris, with particular attention to areas around the heating equipment where accumulation of flammable materials might present hazards. Final inspection of the day's production involved examining each finished candle for consistency of appearance, proper wick placement, and overall quality standards. Candles that met specifications were arranged in storage containers according to size and type, while any pieces requiring additional finishing work were set aside for attention the following day. The systematic organization of finished inventory facilitated efficient fulfillment of customer orders and provided clear visibility into production levels and material usage. The evening routine included updating production records with information about quantities produced, materials consumed, and observations about process variations or material quality. These records served multiple purposes, including tracking costs, planning future production schedules, and identifying trends or patterns that might inform adjustments to techniques or supplier relationships. As darkness settled over the narrow streets of the Subura, Marcus completed his daily review of workshop security measures, ensuring that materials were properly stored, equipment was safely arranged, and the building was secured against unauthorized access. The familiar sounds of the neighborhood, settling into evening routines, provided a backdrop for these final tasks, marking the end of another day in the methodical practice of a craft that had served the illumination needs of Rome for generations, with each day's work adding incrementally to the accumulated knowledge and skill that defined the candlemaker's trade.
Your life as a monastic librarian in 12th century Ireland. The quiet dedication of preserving knowledge through manuscript care and scholarly routine in medieval monasteries. The bell tower of Clonmacnoise released its measured call across the River Shannon as the first pale light of dawn touched the stone walls of the scriptorium, signaling the beginning of another day devoted to the preservation and organization of sacred and scholarly texts. Brother Coleman moved through the corridors with the practiced silence that had become second nature after 12 years of monastic life, his soft leather shoes making barely a whisper against the worn flagstones as he made his way toward the library chambers that represented both his responsibility and his calling. The morning air carried the familiar scents of parchment, oak gall ink, and the faint mustiness that seemed to emanate from ancient vellum, creating an atmosphere that spoke of centuries of scholarly dedication. The library at Clonmacnoise had grown steadily since its founding by St. Ciaran in the 6th century, and by this year of our Lord 1147, during the reign of Turlo O'Connor as High King of Ireland, the collection had expanded to encompass nearly 400 individual manuscripts, each requiring constant attention to preserve their contents for future generations of scholars and monks. The daily routine began with the careful inspection of environmental conditions throughout the various chambers where manuscripts were housed. Brother Coleman moved systematically through each room, observing the levels of moisture that might have accumulated during the night hours, checking for any signs of condensation on the stone walls that could threaten the delicate parchment and vellum materials. The Irish climate presented particular challenges for manuscript preservation, with its frequent rains and persistent humidity requiring constant vigilance to prevent the development of mold or the warping of carefully prepared writing surfaces. Each manuscript storage chest required individual attention and assessment. These heavy oak containers had been constructed by the monastery's carpenters using techniques passed down through generations of woodworkers, with careful attention to creating tight-fitting joints that would exclude moisture while allowing sufficient air circulation to prevent stagnation. The interior surfaces of each chest were lined with carefully treated linen cloths that were replaced periodically when they showed signs of deterioration or contamination. The process of examining individual manuscripts followed established procedures that had been developed over decades of experience with the particular challenges of preserving written materials in the Irish climate. Each codex was carefully removed from its storage location and examined by candlelight for signs of insect damage, moisture staining, or deterioration of the binding materials. The parchment pages were inspected for brittleness, discoloration, or separation of the writing surface that might indicate the need for immediate conservation measures. Brother Coleman maintained detailed records of the condition of each manuscript, using a system of notation that had been established by his predecessor, Brother Finian, who had served as librarian for nearly 30 years before retiring to a life of contemplative prayer. These condition reports were recorded on wax tablets that could be updated regularly, with significant changes or concerns transferred to permanent parchment records that became part of the monastery's administrative archives. The organization of the collection followed both practical and scholarly principles that reflected the educational priorities of the monastic community. The most frequently consulted texts, including copies of the Vulgate Bible, commentaries by the Church Fathers, and liturgical materials used in daily worship, were housed in the chamber closest to the scriptorium, where monks engaged in copying and illumination work. Less frequently accessed materials, including historical chronicles, classical texts, and collections of Irish poetry and legal documents, were stored in the more secure inner chambers, where environmental conditions could be controlled more precisely. The cataloguing system employed at Clonmacnoise represented an adaptation of methods developed at other Irish monasteries, particularly those at Armagh and Kells, with modifications to address the specific needs and characteristics of the local collection. Each manuscript was assigned a unique identifier, based on its subject matter, language, and date of acquisition, with this information recorded in a master catalogue that served as the primary reference tool for locating specific texts or authors. The daily maintenance of writing materials represented another essential responsibility that required specialized knowledge and careful attention to quality standards. The preparation of parchment and vellum involved a complex process that began with the selection of appropriate animal skins, typically from calves, sheep, or goats, that had been raised on monastery lands or obtained through established relationships with local farmers and herders. The initial processing of animal skins required soaking in lime solutions for periods that varied depending on the thickness and characteristics of the raw material. Brother Coleman worked closely with Brother Brendan, who supervised the parchment preparation process, to ensure that each batch of skins was processed according to established standards that would produce writing surfaces of consistent quality and durability. After the lime treatment, the skins underwent a careful scraping process, using specialized tools made from sharpened bone or metal implements, designed to remove hair and excess tissue without damaging the underlying structure that would become the writing surface. This scraping required considerable skill and experience, as excessive pressure could create holes or thin spots that would make the finished parchment unsuitable for important texts. The final preparation of parchment involved stretching the treated skins on wooden frames where they dried under controlled conditions. The tension applied during this drying process needed to be adjusted periodically to ensure uniform thickness and smooth surfaces suitable for receiving ink without bleeding or feathering. Once dried, the parchment was cut into standard sizes that had been established through years of experimentation to optimize the use of raw materials while providing appropriate dimensions for different types of texts. Ink preparation represented another area of specialized knowledge
that required understanding of both the chemical properties of various materials and the practical considerations of creating writing media that would remain legible for extended periods. The primary ink used at Clonmacnoise was made from oak galls, which were collected from trees in the surrounding countryside during specific seasons when their tannin content was at optimal levels. The process of preparing oak gall ink began with the careful grinding of dried galls to produce a fine powder that could be mixed with other ingredients to create the final writing medium. This grinding was performed using stone querns that were reserved exclusively for ink preparation, as any contamination from other materials could affect the color or permanence of the finished product. Iron sulfate, obtained through trade relationships with monasteries in regions where mining operations provided access to appropriate minerals, was combined with the ground oak galls in proportions that had been established through years of testing and refinement. The mixture was dissolved in water that had been collected from specific springs, known to be free from mineral contamination that might interfere with the ink's properties. Gum arabic, imported at considerable expense from distant regions, was added to the ink mixture to improve its flow characteristics and adhesion to parchment surfaces. The proper amount of gum arabic required careful measurement, as too little would result in ink that spread unpredictably, while excessive amounts could create a mixture too thick for smooth writing. The aging process for newly prepared ink involved storing the mixture in sealed containers for periods ranging from several days to several weeks, depending on the intended use and desired characteristics. Brother Coleman tested each batch of ink periodically during this aging process, evaluating its color, consistency, and behavior when applied to sample pieces of parchment. Quality control for writing materials extended beyond the preparation process to include ongoing evaluation of how different batches of parchment and ink performed during actual use. Brother Coleman maintained records of which materials were used for specific copying projects, noting any variations in quality or performance that might inform future preparation decisions. The repair and conservation of damaged manuscripts represented one of the most technically demanding aspects of the librarian's responsibilities. Over the centuries, various texts had suffered damage from moisture, handling, insect activity, or simple aging, requiring specialized techniques to restore them to usable condition while preserving their historical and scholarly value. Minor repairs, such as small tears or separated binding elements, could often be addressed using techniques and materials available within the monastery. Parchment patches were carefully prepared to match the thickness and texture of original materials, with repairs designed to be as unobtrusive as possible, while providing adequate structural support. More significant conservation challenges required consultation with specialists from other monasteries, or collaboration with craftsmen who possessed particular expertise in bookbinding or parchment restoration. These collaborative relationships were maintained through correspondence and occasional visits that allowed for the exchange of knowledge and techniques among practitioners of the manuscript preservation arts. The scriptorium activities that took place adjacent to the library required close coordination to ensure that copying projects proceeded efficiently while maintaining appropriate standards for accuracy and presentation. Brother Coleman worked regularly with the scriptorium supervisor to plan the allocation of materials and to schedule access to reference texts that might be needed by monks engaged in copying or illumination work. The selection of texts for copying involved considerations that extended beyond immediate practical needs to include long-term preservation goals and the educational requirements of the monastic community. Manuscripts that showed signs of significant deterioration were prioritized for copying to ensure that their contents would be preserved even if the original texts eventually became unusable. Collaboration with other monastic libraries represented an important aspect of maintaining and expanding the collection at Clonmacnoise. Regular correspondence with librarians at other institutions provided opportunities to arrange exchanges of texts, share information about newly acquired materials, and coordinate copying projects that might benefit multiple communities. These collaborative relationships also facilitated access to specialized knowledge about manuscript preservation techniques, rare texts, or scholarly developments that might not otherwise reach the relatively isolated monastery. Brother Coleman maintained correspondence with colleagues at Glendalough, Bangor, and several continental monasteries, exchanging information about collection development, conservation techniques, and scholarly resources. The training of younger monks in library procedures represented another ongoing responsibility that required careful attention to both practical skills and underlying principles of manuscript care. Novices assigned to work in the library began with simple tasks such as cleaning and organizing workspaces, gradually advancing to more complex responsibilities as their knowledge and reliability developed. The instruction of new library assistants involved both formal lessons about manuscript handling techniques and practical demonstrations of proper procedures for storage, retrieval, and examination of texts. Brother Coleman had developed a systematic approach to this training that ensured consistent standards while allowing for individual learning styles and aptitudes. Advanced training for monks who showed particular interest or aptitude in library work included instruction in cataloging procedures, basic conservation techniques, and the scholarly skills needed to evaluate and organize manuscript collections. This specialized education often extended over several years and involved collaboration with other experienced librarians who could provide expertise in specific areas. The administrative aspects of library management required ongoing attention to record keeping, resource allocation, and planning for future development of the collection. Brother Coleman maintained detailed inventories of all materials and supplies, tracking consumption rates and planning for the procurement of additional resources based on projected needs. Budget considerations for library operations involved negotiations with the monastery's administrative leadership to secure adequate funding for materials, equipment, and occasional specialized services required for conservation or copying projects. These discussions required careful documentation of needs and clear explanation of how library expenditures supported the broader educational and spiritual mission of the monastic community. The seasonal patterns of library work reflected both practical considerations related to environmental conditions and the liturgical calendar that governed monastic life. During the warmer months of summer, when humidity levels were more manageable, major conservation projects were often undertaken, taking advantage of conditions that facilitated the drying and treatment of parchment materials. Winter months brought different challenges and opportunities, with reduced daylight hours limiting certain types of detailed work while providing extended periods for scholarly research, catalogue maintenance, and planning for future projects. The heating of library spaces during cold weather required careful attention to prevent excessive dryness that might damage parchment or create fire hazards near valuable manuscripts. The integration of library activities with the broader scholarly and spiritual life of the monastery required ongoing attention to the educational needs of the community and the research interests of individual monks. Brother Coleman worked regularly with the prior and other senior members of the community to ensure that library resources supported both daily liturgical requirements and longer-term scholarly projects. Special collections within the library required individualized attention and specialized storage arrangements. The monastery's collection of illuminated manuscripts, including several gospel books created by local artists, demanded particular care due to the sensitivity of painted and gilded decorative elements to light exposure and environmental fluctuations. Historical documents related to the monastery's founding and development, including charters, land grants, and correspondence with ecclesiastical and secular authorities, were maintained in a separate archive with enhanced security measures and restricted access procedures. These materials served both practical administrative purposes and represented important historical resources for understanding the development of Irish monasticism. The library's collection of Irish language materials, including poetry, legal texts, and historical chronicles, required specialized knowledge for proper cataloging and conservation due to the unique characteristics of Irish script and writing traditions. Brother Coleman had studied these materials extensively, developing expertise that made him a valuable resource for scholars from other institutions seeking information about Irish literary and historical traditions. Visiting scholars from other monasteries or educational institutions required special accommodation and supervision to ensure that valuable manuscripts were handled appropriately, while providing access to materials needed for legitimate research purposes. Brother Coleman had developed procedures for managing these visits that balanced scholarly access with preservation concerns. The daily rhythm of library work was punctuated by the regular observance of the canonical hours that structured monastic life. The bells calling the community to prayer provided natural breakpoints in library activities, with work schedules designed to accommodate these liturgical requirements, while maintaining productivity and continuity in ongoing projects. Evening activities in the library often focused on administrative tasks that could be performed by candlelight, such as updating catalogue records, planning the following day's activities, or conducting correspondence with colleagues at other institutions. These quieter hours provided opportunities for reflection on the day's accomplishments and consideration of longer-term goals and challenges. The physical demands of library work required attention to proper techniques for handling heavy manuscripts and managing the repetitive motions involved in catalogue maintenance and manuscript examination. Brother Coleman had learned to pace his activities throughout the day to prevent fatigue while maintaining the careful attention to detail that manuscript preservation demanded. Tool maintenance represented another ongoing responsibility, with the various implements used for manuscript repair, parchment preparation, and general library maintenance requiring regular cleaning, sharpening, and replacement as needed. The specialized tools used for conservation work were particularly important, as their condition directly affected the quality of repair work and the safety of valuable manuscripts. The relationship between the library and the monastery's educational activities required ongoing coordination to ensure that teaching materials were available when needed while protecting manuscripts from excessive handling or inappropriate use. Brother Coleman worked with the monastery school's instructors to develop procedures for accessing and using library materials in educational contexts. Documentation of library procedures and policies served both practical and historical purposes, creating records that would assist future librarians, while providing insight into the development of manuscript preservation techniques over time. Brother Coleman maintained detailed procedural manuals that recorded not only current practices, but also the reasoning behind specific approaches and techniques. The gradual accumulation of knowledge about manuscript preservation continued throughout Brother Coleman's career, with new challenges and discoveries leading to refinements in technique and understanding. The sharing of this knowledge with colleagues at other institutions contributed to the broader development of library science and manuscript preservation throughout the Irish monastic community. Weather monitoring became an increasingly important aspect of daily routine, as Brother Coleman learned to anticipate environmental challenges and adjust library activities accordingly. The development of intuitive understanding about how atmospheric conditions affected manuscript materials allowed for proactive measures that prevented damage rather than simply responding to problems after they occurred. The evening routine in the library involved careful securing of all materials, banking of fires used for heating and lighting, and final inspection of environmental conditions throughout the storage areas. The systematic approach to these closing procedures ensured that manuscripts remained safe and secure during overnight hours, while providing optimal conditions for preservation. As the day's activities drew toward their conclusion, Brother Coleman completed his final rounds through the library chambers, checking that each manuscript had been properly returned to its designated storage location, and that all environmental controls were functioning appropriately. The familiar weight of keys at his belt represented the trust placed in him by the monastic community, and the responsibility he bore for preserving the accumulated wisdom and knowledge contained within the monastery's walls. The soft illumination of candles created gentle pools of light throughout the library spaces, casting warm shadows that had become as familiar as the texts themselves over years of dedicated service. The evening examination of catalogue records and planning for the following day's activities provided a sense of continuity and purpose that extended beyond individual daily accomplishments to encompass the longer-term mission of preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. The sound of the final bell calling the community to compline marked the approaching end of another day devoted to the quiet but essential work of manuscript preservation, with each day's careful attention to detail contributing incrementally to the accumulated preservation of human knowledge and spiritual wisdom that defined the monastic librarian's calling in medieval Ireland.
How scrolls were catalogued in the libraries of Alexandria. In the great libraries of Alexandria, where knowledge gathered like sediment along the shores of the Mediterranean, The work of cataloguing scrolls proceeded with methodical precision that would span generations of scholarly dedication. The librarians who walked these halls understood that their task was not merely to organize papyrus and ink, but to create a system that would allow future scholars to navigate the accumulated wisdom of civilizations with the same careful attention that a navigator might use to chart the position of stars. The process began each morning as the first pale light filtered through the high clerestory windows of the cataloguing hall, where rows of cedar tables stretched beneath bronze oil lamps that would burn steadily throughout the long hours ahead. The head cataloguer, typically a man who had devoted 3 decades or more to understanding the intricate relationships between texts, would assign bundles of newly acquired scrolls to junior librarians, each of whom carried wooden tablets coated with fresh beeswax, ready to record the essential details that would determine where each manuscript would find its permanent home within the vast collection. The acquisition of scrolls followed established protocols that had evolved over 2 centuries of library administration. Ships arriving at Alexandria's harbor were required by municipal decree to surrender any scrolls in their possession to library officials, who would employ teams of professional scribes to create faithful copies before returning the originals to their owners. These copied scrolls, along with those purchased from dealers throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, would arrive at the cataloguing hall in leather satchels sealed with wax impressions, each marked with basic information about their origin, the circumstances of their acquisition, and the identity of the acquiring agent. Before any scroll could be properly catalogued, it required careful physical examination to determine its condition, authenticity, and probable age. The cataloguer would slowly unroll just enough of the papyrus to examine the quality of the writing, noting whether the scribe had used carbon-based ink or the more expensive iron gall preparations, the spacing between lines, the presence of marginal annotations, and the general state of preservation. Scrolls showing signs of damage from moisture, insects, or rough handling would be noted for repair work, which might involve careful cleaning with dampened linen cloths treated with diluted vinegar, or in cases of more serious deterioration. The painstaking process of copying the text onto fresh papyrus prepared according to traditional methods before the original became completely illegible. The actual cataloguing process followed a systematic approach that had been refined through generations of scholarly practice and institutional memory. Each scroll would be assigned a unique identification number, carefully carved into a small wooden tag fashioned from boxwood or olive wood, that would be attached with linen cord to the scroll's cylindrical storage container. This number would correspond to entries in the Great Catalogue codices, massive volumes bound in leather treated with oak gall and organized according to subject matter, author, geographical origin, and chronological period. The cataloguers worked with reed pens cut from the marshes of the Nile Delta, and carefully prepared ink made from lamp black, gum arabic, and rainwater collected in bronze cisterns, recording not only the title and author of each work, but also its length measured in standard columnar units, the condition of the papyrus substrate, any notable variations from other known copies of the same text that might indicate different manuscript traditions, and detailed notes about the scroll's provenance, including the names of previous owners when such information could be determined. When a scroll contained multiple works by different authors, a situation that occurred frequently with collections of poetry, philosophical fragments, or technical treatises, each individual text would receive its own catalogue entry, with elaborate cross-references linking related materials and indicating the physical position of each work within the composite scroll. These cross-references were recorded using a system of abbreviations and symbols that had been developed specifically for the library's needs, creating a dense network of connections that experienced catalogers could navigate with practiced ease. Subject classification required considerable scholarly expertise and familiarity with the intellectual traditions of multiple civilizations, as many ancient texts did not conform to rigid categories of knowledge, but instead wove together mathematical principles with astronomical observations, medical theory with philosophical speculation, or historical narrative with geographical description. The catalogers developed an elaborate system of primary and secondary classifications, employing Greek letters, numerical notations, and specialized symbols to indicate the various subjects covered within each scroll and the relative importance of different thematic elements. The physical arrangement of the scrolls within the library storage areas followed the cataloging system with precise attention to accessibility, preservation, and scholarly convenience. Scrolls were stored in cylindrical containers fashioned from cedar wood, imported from Lebanon, aromatic woods that helped discourage insects and other pests while providing protection from moisture and dust that might otherwise damage the delicate papyrus. These containers were arranged on shelves constructed from Syrian oak according to subject matter, with additional organizational principles based on language, estimated date of composition, and the scholarly reputation of the author. Geographic organization played an increasingly important role in the cataloging system, as the library's collection expanded to include materials from distant regions of the known world, reflecting Alexandria's position as the great crossroads of Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilizations. Scrolls were often grouped according to their place of origin, or the cultural tradition they represented, creating distinct sections for works from Athens and other Greek city-states, Rome and the Latin territories, Babylon and the Persian domains, Egypt and Nubia, and the various kingdoms of Asia Minor, each with its own subcategories and specialized filing systems. The catalogers maintained detailed records of which scrolls were consulted by visiting scholars, creating a system of accountability that helped prevent theft while also providing valuable statistical information about which texts were considered most important by the international scholarly community. When a scroll was removed for consultation, the supervising librarian would record the scholar's name, his city of origin, and institutional affiliation if any, the specific date and time of removal, and the expected duration of use on specially prepared wooden tablets that were kept in designated niches near each scroll's normal storage location. Language classification presented ongoing challenges for the catalogers, particularly as the library's collection expanded to include works in languages and scripts that were not commonly understood by the predominantly Greek-speaking library staff. While Greek and Latin texts formed the core of the collection and could be handled by most catalogers, scrolls written in Egyptian hieroglyphic or hieratic scripts, Aramaic, Hebrew, Phoenician, various Persian dialects, and other languages required specialized knowledge for proper cataloging and classification. The library maintained formal relationships with scholars, translators, and cultural specialists from throughout the Mediterranean world, who could provide assistance with these more exotic materials. Though the process of obtaining accurate catalog information for texts in unfamiliar languages often required months of careful study and extensive correspondence with experts in distant cities. These linguistic challenges led to the development of a specialized annotation system that could record basic information about foreign language texts even when their full content remained incomprehensible to the cataloging staff. The preservation of catalog information itself became a major institutional concern as the collection grew to encompass hundreds of thousands of individual scrolls and the catalog system expanded to fill dozens of leather-bound volumes. Multiple copies of each catalog section were maintained in different locations within the library complex, with regular copying sessions supervised by senior catalogers, to ensure that the loss of any single catalog volume through fire, theft, or other mishap would not result in the permanent misplacement of significant portions of the collection. These copying sessions followed established procedures that had been refined over decades of institutional experience. Senior catalogers would dictate catalog entries to teams of experienced scribes, with each entry being checked multiple times for accuracy before being incorporated into the duplicate catalog volumes. The scribes employed for this work were selected for their exceptional penmanship and attention to detail, as errors in catalog transcription could render entire sections of the collection effectively inaccessible to future researchers. Disputes occasionally arose among catalogers regarding the proper classification of particular texts, especially those that seemed to bridge multiple areas of knowledge or those whose authorship remained uncertain despite extensive scholarly investigation. These disagreements were not resolved hastily, but were instead the subject of lengthy discussions among the senior library staff,
with the various arguments and supporting evidence being carefully recorded in special annotation sections of the catalogue that provided future librarians with detailed information about ongoing scholarly debates concerning specific works. Such annotations often included references to supporting evidence for different interpretations, citations of relevant scholarly opinions from recognized authorities, and sometimes even copies of correspondence with experts from other libraries or academic institutions. This practice created a rich historical record of how ancient scholars understood and categorized their own intellectual traditions, while also providing practical guidance for future catalogers who might encounter similar classification problems. The daily routine of cataloging work followed patterns that remained remarkably consistent across seasons and years, creating a rhythm of scholarly labor that became deeply ingrained in the institutional culture of the library. Catalogers would arrive at their assigned work areas shortly after dawn, spending the first portion of each day reviewing scrolls that had been partially catalogued during previous sessions and checking their work against established standards and procedures. The careful, repetitive nature of this work created a meditative quality that experienced catalogers found conducive to maintaining focus and attention over long periods, as the familiar processes of physical examination, textual analysis, notation, and classification became almost automatic responses that allowed the mind to engage fully with the intellectual content of the materials being processed. This state of concentrated attention was considered essential for the kind of scholarly judgment required to make appropriate cataloging decisions. Weather conditions affected the cataloging process in subtle but important ways that required constant attention from the library staff. During the humid months when moisture levels rose with the flooding of the Nile, scrolls would be handled with extra care to prevent damage to the papyrus fibers, which became more fragile when exposed to excessive humidity. Catalogers would work with specially treated cloths to absorb moisture from their hands before handling delicate materials, and work schedules would sometimes be adjusted to take advantage of periods when atmospheric conditions were most favorable for manuscript handling. The dry months presented different challenges, as the lack of humidity could make papyrus brittle and more susceptible to cracking or tearing, while also creating static electricity that made the handling of lightweight materials more difficult. During these periods, catalogers would employ bronze implements for manipulating scrolls rather than working directly with their hands, and would take frequent breaks to prevent the buildup of static charges that might damage delicate texts. The training of new catalogers involved a lengthy apprenticeship process that could extend over several years, during which aspiring librarians would work alongside experienced colleagues, gradually learning the complex systems of classification and notation that governed the library's operations. This training process required not only the development of technical skills in manuscript handling and catalog maintenance, but also the acquisition of broad scholarly knowledge across multiple disciplines and cultural traditions. New catalogers were expected to demonstrate competence in reading and writing both Greek and Latin, familiarity with the major philosophical and scientific traditions of the ancient world, basic knowledge of mathematics and astronomy sufficient to understand technical texts, and at least rudimentary acquaintance with the historical and literary traditions of major civilizations represented in the library's collection. This extensive educational requirement meant that most catalogers came from relatively privileged backgrounds and had received formal training in rhetoric, philosophy, or other advanced subjects before beginning their library careers. Special procedures governed the cataloging of scrolls that contained rare or unique texts, materials that were considered particularly valuable, either because of their age, their authorship, their subject matter, or their rarity in the scholarly world. These exceptional scrolls often received additional layers of documentation, including detailed physical descriptions that recorded the exact dimensions of the papyrus, the characteristics of the writing materials used, notes about any unusual features of the script or layout, and sometimes even traced copies of distinctive letter forms or decorative elements. The acquisition history of such valuable scrolls was also documented in greater detail than was typical for ordinary materials, with records of previous ownership, the circumstances under which the library had obtained the text, any payments made for acquisition, and correspondence with scholars or dealers involved in the transaction. This information was considered valuable, not only for administrative purposes but also for scholarly research into the transmission of important texts through successive generations of copyists and collectors. The systematic approach to cataloging extended beyond individual scroll records to encompass the creation of specialized indexes and finding aids that would allow scholars to locate materials according to various criteria beyond the basic subject classifications. These supplementary tools included alphabetical listings of authors with cross-references to variant spellings and attributions, chronological arrangements of texts according to their estimated dates of composition, and thematic groupings that brought together works dealing with similar topics regardless of their formal classification within the main catalog system. The creation and maintenance of these secondary access tools required significant additional labor from the cataloging staff, as each new scroll added to the collection potentially required updates to multiple index systems. Senior catalogers would regularly review these supplementary tools to ensure their accuracy and completeness, making corrections and additions as necessary to maintain their usefulness for scholarly research. As scrolls aged and required conservation work to prevent further deterioration, the cataloging system had to accommodate changes in physical condition and sometimes in storage location. Updated entries would be made in the catalog records, with careful notation of any alterations to the text that might have occurred during conservation treatments, changes in the physical appearance of the scroll, or modifications to its storage arrangements within the library complex. This ongoing maintenance of catalog information required constant vigilance from the library staff, as the dynamic nature of a living collection meant that catalog entries could never be considered permanently fixed or complete. Regular reviews of catalog accuracy became an established part of library operations, with systematic checking of randomly selected entries to identify and correct any discrepancies between catalog records and the actual condition or location of scrolls. The catalogers worked within a broader institutional framework that connected their daily activities to the larger scholarly mission of the library, and its role in the intellectual life of Alexandria and the wider Mediterranean world. Regular meetings with other library departments ensured that cataloging decisions were coordinated with acquisition policies, conservation priorities, and the research needs of visiting scholars, while also providing opportunities for catalogers to influence broader institutional policies based on their detailed knowledge of the collection's strengths and weaknesses. These administrative connections required catalogers to maintain awareness of broader intellectual trends and scholarly debates that might influence the importance or accessibility of particular texts, as well as practical considerations such as storage capacity, preservation resources, and the financial constraints that affected library operations. Senior catalogers often served on institutional committees responsible for acquisition decisions, policy development, and long-term planning for the library's growth and development. The physical layout of the cataloging hall reflected the systematic nature of the work being performed there, with workstations arranged to facilitate the efficient flow of materials from initial acquisition through final placement in the collection. Designated areas were established for different stages of the cataloging process, from preliminary examination and condition assessment through detailed analysis and classification to final record creation and cross-referencing activities. Storage areas for work in progress were organized according to the same systematic principles that governed the main collection, creating a miniature version of the larger library organization within the cataloging department itself. This arrangement helped catalogers maintain awareness of the relationships between different materials and facilitated the kind of comparative analysis that was essential for accurate classification and cross-referencing. Evening hours in the cataloging hall took on a quieter, more contemplative character as the day's urgent business gave way to more reflective tasks that required sustained concentration and scholarly judgment. Catalogers would often use these peaceful hours for reviewing difficult classification problems that had accumulated during the day, updating complex cross-reference systems, or working on the periodic copying projects that ensured the preservation of catalog information. The soft illumination provided by oil lamps created an atmosphere conducive to careful, methodical work, while the gentle sounds of reed pens scratching against papyrus and the occasional rustling of scroll containers being moved and rearranged provided a soothing background that many catalogers found helpful for maintaining focus during long periods of detailed work. These evening sessions often produce some of the most thoughtful and accurate cataloging work, as the reduced pace allowed for more thorough consideration of complex classification decisions. The seasonal rhythms of cataloging work varied with the academic calendar that governed much of Alexandria's intellectual life and with the patterns of maritime trade that brought new materials to the library throughout the year. Spring months often saw increased activity as new acquisitions arrived with the resumption of regular shipping after the winter storms, while the hot summer months might see a reduction in the pace of work as catalogers adjusted their schedules to accommodate the challenging weather conditions. Winter periods, when fewer new materials arrived and the cooler temperatures made extended indoor work more comfortable, provided opportunities for more intensive projects such as comprehensive reviews of existing catalog sections, major reorganization efforts, or the creation of new finding aids and supplementary indexes. These seasonal variations in workload created natural opportunities for catalogers to pursue specialized projects and to develop improvements in their classification methods and recording techniques. The creation of cross-references between related texts required catalogers to possess not only extensive knowledge of scholarly traditions and intellectual connections, but also the ability to anticipate the research needs of future scholars who might approach the collection from perspectives that had not yet been fully developed. A philosophical treatise might contain mathematical concepts that would require cross-referencing to works on geometry or arithmetic, while historical chronicles often contained information relevant to geographical studies, biographical research, or investigations into ancient religious practices. These intellectual connections formed an intricate web of relationships that the cataloging system sought to make visible and accessible to researchers, requiring catalogers to think beyond the immediate content of individual scrolls to consider the broader context of ancient learning and the ways in which different areas of knowledge intersected and influenced each other. This holistic approach to cataloging reflected the comprehensive educational ideals of Hellenistic scholarship and the library's mission to serve as a universal repository of human knowledge. Quality control measures ensured that cataloging work met the high standards expected in such a prestigious institution, with multiple levels of review and verification built into the standard procedures. Senior catalogers would regularly examine the work of their junior colleagues, checking for accuracy in transcription, appropriateness of classification decisions, completeness of cross-references, and adherence to established formatting conventions. These review sessions often resulted in lengthy discussions about proper cataloging practices and the application of classification principles to unusual or problematic materials, contributing to the ongoing refinement of the library's systematic approach to knowledge organization. The collaborative nature of these quality control processes helped maintain consistency across different cataloging teams and time periods, while also providing opportunities for experienced catalogers to pass on their expertise to newer members of the staff. The tools and materials used in cataloging work were carefully selected and maintained, to ensure consistent quality in record keeping and to support the precise detailed work that accurate cataloging required. Reed pens were cut and shaped according to established specifications, with different pen styles reserved for different aspects of the cataloging process such as main entries, cross-references, and marginal annotations. The ink used for catalog entries was prepared according to traditional recipes that emphasized permanence and clarity, with ingredients carefully measured and mixed to produce a consistent product that would remain legible for decades or centuries. The papyrus sheets used for catalog records were selected for their smoothness, durability, and ability to accept ink cleanly, while the leather used for binding catalog volumes was treated with preservatives that would protect the records from insects, moisture, and other environmental threats. Record-keeping practices extended beyond the basic catalog entries to include comprehensive documentation of cataloging procedures themselves, creating an institutional memory that would help maintain consistency and quality across generations of library staff. Detailed instruction manuals were maintained and regularly updated to reflect changes in procedures and the lessons learned from experience, providing new catalogers with comprehensive guidance on proper techniques and established practices. These procedural documents also served as references for resolving disputes about cataloging methods and for ensuring that institutional knowledge would not be lost when experienced catalogers retired or moved to other positions. The systematic documentation of procedures reflected the same scholarly approach that governed the cataloging of the library's manuscript collection, treating the cataloging process itself as a form of knowledge worthy of careful preservation and transmission. The integration of newly catalogued scrolls into the existing collection required careful planning and coordination to maintain the logical organization of materials while accommodating the continuous growth of the collection. Storage areas were periodically reorganized according to systematic plans that optimized the use of available space while preserving the accessibility of materials and the coherence of subject groupings.
These reorganization projects involved the physical movement of thousands of scroll containers, requiring careful coordination among catalogers, storage attendants, and other library personnel to ensure that materials were not damaged or misplaced during the transition process. Temporary catalog records tracked the movement of materials during reorganization periods, while permanent catalog entries were updated to reflect new storage locations and any changes in classification that might result from the reorganization process. Collaboration with scribes, copyists, and other manuscript specialists formed an essential part of the cataloging workflow, particularly when dealing with damaged or deteriorating scrolls that required transcription or restoration work to preserve their contents. Catalogers would work closely with these technical specialists to ensure that treatment decisions supported the long-term preservation of texts while maintaining their accessibility for scholarly use. The relationship between catalogers and conservation specialists required ongoing communication about priorities, methods, and scheduling, as the demands of preservation work had to be balanced against the need to make materials available for research use. Catalogers provided conservation specialists with detailed information about the scholarly importance of different texts, helping to guide decisions about which materials should receive priority treatment when resources were limited. The cataloging of multilingual texts presented particular challenges that required specialized knowledge and careful attention to cultural and linguistic nuances that might not be immediately apparent to catalogers, whose primary training had been in Greek and Latin traditions. Scrolls containing texts in multiple languages might receive separate catalog entries for each linguistic component, or might be classified according to their primary language, with extensive cross-references and annotations describing secondary linguistic content. These multilingual cataloging decisions required considerable scholarly judgment, and often involved consultation with specialists in particular languages or cultural traditions, adding layers of complexity to the cataloging process that demanded additional time and expertise. The results of these consultations would be carefully documented in the catalog records, providing future researchers with detailed information about the linguistic characteristics of complex texts. Administrative oversight of the cataloging process involved regular reporting to library supervisors and institutional authorities about the progress of cataloging work, the condition of the collection, any significant discoveries or problems encountered during the cataloging process, and the resource needs of the cataloging department. These reports contributed to institutional planning and resource allocation decisions, while also providing historical documentation of the library's development and the evolution of its cataloging practices over time. The preparation of these administrative reports required catalogers to maintain detailed statistical records of their work, tracking the number of scrolls processed, the types of materials cataloged, the time required for different kinds of cataloging tasks, and any unusual challenges or discoveries that might influence future cataloging procedures. This quantitative approach to tracking cataloging productivity reflected the systematic, scholarly approach that characterized all aspects of the library's operations. The relationship between catalogers and the community of visiting scholars created ongoing opportunities for feedback and refinement of cataloging practices based on actual patterns of use and evolving research needs. Scholars would often provide catalogers with information about previously unrecognized connections between texts, corrections to attributions or dating, or suggestions for improving the accessibility of particular materials. This ongoing dialogue between catalogers and users ensured that the cataloging system remained responsive to the changing needs of the scholarly community, while also contributing to the continuous improvement of cataloging methods and standards. The feedback from users was systematically collected and analyzed, with successful suggestions being incorporated into standard procedures and documented in training materials for future catalogers. Maintenance of cataloging equipment and workspace environments required daily attention to ensure optimal working conditions for the precise, detailed work that accurate cataloging demanded. Oil lamps were cleaned and refilled each morning, with wicks trimmed to provide steady, even illumination that would not strain the eyes during long periods of reading and writing. Writing surfaces were kept scrupulously clean and free of dust, debris, or other contaminants that might interfere with the smooth flow of ink or damage delicate papyrus materials, while storage areas were regularly inspected for signs of pest activity, moisture problems, or other environmental threats that might endanger the collection. These maintenance activities were integrated into the daily routines of cataloging work, creating habits of care and attention that supported both efficiency and preservation. The development of specialized notation systems allowed catalogers to record complex information about scroll contents, physical characteristics, and intellectual relationships in abbreviated forms that conserved space in catalog records while maintaining the precision necessary for accurate retrieval and identification. These notation systems evolved gradually over decades of cataloging experience, with successful innovations being tested, refined, and eventually adopted throughout the library system. The systematic documentation of these notation systems ensured that their meanings would remain clear to future catalogers, while also providing the flexibility necessary to accommodate new types of materials or classification challenges that might emerge as the collection continued to grow and diversify. Training in these specialized notations formed an important component of cataloger education, requiring new staff members to master not only the symbols and abbreviations themselves, but also the underlying principles that governed their application. Seasonal celebrations and religious observances created natural rhythms in the cataloging work that reflected the broader cultural context within which the library operated. During festival periods or times of religious significance, catalogers might give special attention to processing materials related to current celebrations, ensuring that scholars and other library users had ready access to texts that complemented their seasonal research interests or devotional practices. These periodic shifts in cataloging priorities created opportunities for catalogers to develop specialized expertise in particular subject areas, while also ensuring that the library's resources remained closely connected to the intellectual and spiritual life of the surrounding community. The integration of seasonal considerations into cataloging work reflected the library's role not only as a repository of ancient knowledge, but also as an active participant in the ongoing cultural life of Alexandria. The cataloging of fragmentary texts required the development of specialized techniques for dealing with incomplete materials, while still providing useful access points for researchers interested in recovering and understanding partial survivals of important works. Catalogers learned to describe fragmentary texts in ways that highlighted their potential significance while clearly indicating the limitations imposed by missing or damaged portions. Cross-references to complete works by the same authors or treatments of similar subjects helped researchers understand the context and probable content of fragmentary materials, while detailed physical descriptions of the fragments themselves provided information that might be useful for future attempts at reconstruction or for comparative studies of manuscript traditions. Regular inventory procedures ensured that the physical collection remained accurately synchronized with catalog records, preventing the gradual accumulation of discrepancies that could render portions of the collection effectively inaccessible to researchers. These systematic checking procedures involved the careful comparison of catalog entries with actual scroll locations and conditions, identifying any scrolls that might have been misplaced, misfiled, or damaged since their last catalog review. The inventory process often revealed minor discrepancies that could be quickly corrected, but occasionally uncovered more serious problems that required extensive investigation and remedial action.
The systematic nature of these inventory procedures helped maintain the reliability and accuracy of the cataloging system, while also providing opportunities to identify and address preservation problems before they became serious threats to important materials. The training of catalogers included extensive instruction in the historical development of writing systems, manuscript production techniques, and scholarly traditions that provided the cultural context necessary for making informed judgments about the dating, attribution, and significance of ancient texts. This historical perspective helped catalogers recognize subtle indicators of a text's origins and development that might not be immediately apparent to scholars with more specialized but narrow training. Understanding the evolution of writing styles, the characteristics of different scribal traditions, and the historical development of various intellectual disciplines allowed catalogers to make more accurate and nuanced classification decisions, while also identifying materials that might be of particular interest to researchers working in specific areas of ancient studies. Documentation of cataloging decisions included detailed notes about the reasoning behind particular classification choices, creating a historical record that would help future catalogers understand the principles and considerations that guided their predecessors' work. These decision records provided valuable guidance for maintaining consistency in the application of cataloging standards, while also documenting the evolution of the library's approach to knowledge organization. The accumulation of these decision records over time created a rich resource for understanding not only the development of cataloging practices, but also the changing perspectives and priorities of the scholarly community that the library served. Future researchers would be able to trace the evolution of ancient scholarship through the lens of cataloging decisions and the reasoning that supported them. The integration of new acquisitions into the existing catalog structure required careful consideration of how unfamiliar materials might fit within established classification systems, while also maintaining the flexibility necessary to accommodate innovative approaches to knowledge organization. Catalogers developed procedures for handling materials that challenged existing categories, creating new classification schemes when necessary while preserving the overall coherence and logic of the catalog system. These adaptive approaches to cataloging reflected the dynamic nature of ancient learning and the library's commitment to serving as a comprehensive repository for all forms of human knowledge, regardless of their conformity to established intellectual traditions or organizational schemes. Evening maintenance routines included the careful cleaning and proper storage of all cataloging tools and materials, the securing of work in progress to prevent loss or damage, and the methodical preparation of workspace for the following day's activities. These daily closure procedures helped maintain the orderly environment necessary for precise cataloging work while also protecting valuable materials and equipment from potential damage during the unattended nighttime hours.